And there we go. Hey guys, what is up? Dustin Fowler here, getting ready to facilitate my second all year long. We're looking at language and culture, particularly the spatial distribution of languages. Culture is a bear of a unit. In the Rubenstein book, which is what most of us are using, culture is going to be your chapters 4, 5, 6, and really the first two key issues of chapter 7. And it's by far the most chapter numerous section that you're going to do if you're using Rubenstein or Faubourg. But when it's all said and done, it weighs the same amount on the AP exam. So when you study language, you want to study it just like you would study anything else, and that is through spatial lenses. You want to be able to look at the distribution and how it got to where it is and why. And so we're really focusing on the where of why. You're going to hear me say that a lot. Let's get started. So there's my presentation. Let me go ahead and get that in presentation mode. Sorry, I wasn't quite there yet, I don't guess. We're going to get my captions up so you guys can see what I'm saying as I'm saying it. And now I'm going to go to the beginning of my presentation. So my name is Dustin Fowler. We're looking at the geography of language. This is a review, 7 o'clock Thursday night. Here's our objectives for what we're going to do today. One, we're looking at language and culture. We're trying to understand the origins of language. Very briefly, we're going to take a look at that and maybe bring that into a discussion of language families. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at the Indo-European language family and talk about why we spend so much time looking at that one. We're going to transition and look a little bit at Sino-Tibetan and spend a little bit of time looking at the linguistic diversity in Africa and focus maybe a little bit more on other language families in doing so. And then finally, we're going to look a little bit down here at the diffusion of English, arguably one of the most useful languages on earth, not just because we speak in the United States, but generally speaking, it is a massively spoken language by as a second language, you've got more potential speakers of English than you have of Mandarin, which is the #1 most spoken native language. We're going to talk about these things. So why language? Why are we taking the time to study language in APHG? Well, it's part of culture, right? Last week, we talked about what culture is. We looked at material versus non-material culture. In other words, your visible versus your invisible. And language is very much a part of our, it can be written, things to be written down, but language itself is invisible in terms of our culture. It's non-material. It's something that is a lot of times we think about our identity, we think about it goes hand in hand with the language that we speak, which does not have to be a written language. Many of your indigenous languages today, Africa has more linguistic diversity than any other place in the world. Many of the languages there are spoken by small indigenous groups that don't have a written language. So the reason we are studying language is to understand the spatial perspective, or the why of where. Language is a part of who we are. It's a huge part of our identity. I just mentioned that. Many cultures measure their culture by their language, okay? So you might think that religion is another big part of this, okay? But language is as big, if not bigger in some cases, than even religion in terms of how people measure who they are based on their identity. A perfect example is I always show my students a video of a Native American speaker. She is the last fluent Native American speaker of this particular language that she's speaking. And she says that sometimes she will still dream in the language that she grew up with. But she has to speak English in order for anyone to be able to understand her. Now, what must it be like to tell your stories, to tell your history, or to talk with people in your village that are supposed to be those who carry out the legacy of your people in somebody else's words? And that's the key here. It's hard for us a lot of times in the United States to really understand, surely, that when someone else is speaking a language as a second language, especially out of obligation, they're having to use other people's words in order to convey meanings that they might have inside of themselves. And often it doesn't translate just right. For example, my stepsister is fluent in French. Okay, and she says that whenever she would go over to France and speak with people that are native there, she sounds like she's talking in her mind. She says that she feels that people might think she's ignorant or might think that she's not super smart because she doesn't know exactly every word to be able to say exactly what it is she means to say in English. It's the same kind of thing. Another really important thing that we're going to look at with language in particular is that it is under attack by the forces of globalization. And when I say globalization, remember last week we talked about this, and I mentioned that there is economic, cultural, and a third, political globalization. The main thing we're looking at here is cultural and economic globalization is what is really attacking language on a local level. Here's a picture of Maasai herdsmen. This is an indigenous group that kind of lives over here in Eastern Africa and Kenya. They are herders, all right? And you can see they have very, unique look, very, they are one of a kind. They are very much an independent identity, a culture in and of themselves. There is another picture that I could not find it for the life of me, but I've shown it every single year that I've been teaching this class. And it is a picture of one of these individuals on a cell phone. So he's sitting out there maybe with one of these staves or whatever in his hand in this tribal gear, and he's on the phone. What language do you think he's speaking on the phone? What do you think he's trying to do? Is he speaking in his native tongue? Is he talking to his neighbor down the street? Probably not. It's probably some kind of an economic basis. Maybe he's trying to make a transaction. Maybe he's trying to do business with someone. But he's on the phone, and he is talking probably not in his native language. So when you think about individuals that maybe have a language with no written tradition, okay, or they have a language that maybe a few people in one part of a country speak, but they want to do business on a grander scale. They want to have opportunities, education. They want to have better economic opportunity. They want to have a better life for their kids. Well, what language are they going to speak in order to do that? They're going to end up going home and figuring out different ways that they can learn English or French, or maybe in this case Swahili, or some kind of a larger, more widely spoken language that might be to them a language of opportunity. And in doing so, maybe they don't teach their kids to speak their native language. They might teach their kids to speak English or French or Swahili. So this is what I mean whenever I mentioned up here that languages on a local level are under attack by the forces of globalization. Well, languages go extinct on a regular basis. Right now, numbers project that somewhere around 6,700 different languages might exist today. I don't know exactly what the number is. Like, more than half of those languages are projected to die out in the next, several decades. I mean, it's unbelievable how much globalization, how much these things are attacking, I guess, the way we live and the way that people interact together on a global level, culturally and economically. It really does put a damper on local languages. Understanding cultural diffusion and cultural landscape is intertwined with understanding the distribution of language across space. What I mean by this is you can't go anywhere without seeing language as part of the local geography, as part of the cultural landscape. When we talk about toponyms, what do we mean by that? Anybody know what a toponym is? If you know it, put it in the comments. Toponym, simply a place name. All right, you can have places like I was just now in Metter, Georgia over the weekend, seeing my relatives. We had a family reunion. All right, and interestingly, you can see that the border of Metter is a circle, except for this little section here on the other side of the interstate. I'm sorry, on the other side of this highway. So obviously they have just a radius for their boundary. Very, very small town, but over here, hope you like it. I guess that's how you say it. Interesting place. I was wondering how in the world did this place get its name? Toponyms, place names. Sometimes you'll see places named after politicians like Washington, or places or streets or intersections or exchanges named after Martin Luther King, in particular in the South. Entertainment or education. You might see elements of entertainment. You might see elements of language in entertainment and education as well. How did languages start? What's the origins of language? Well, you've got the Tower of Babel. Any churchgoers out there know about the story of the Tower of Babel? Apparently, according to the Bible, what you've got people doing is they were building this massive tower in order to reach straight up to heaven and, I guess, be on equal footing with God. So, according to the story, God destroyed the tower and scrambled up all the words of mankind, and individuals no longer spoke the same language, because with the same language, they had enough power to rival God. And therefore, if they can't speak the same language, they can't work together in order to build such a magnificent structure or whatever it might be. And so individuals started to spread out and migrate on the basis of whatever they spoke. And that's according to, the Bible, why people speak the way they do. But maybe it's not so cut and dry like that. Really, the truth is, no linguists know exactly what the origin of language is, or if there ever was a single original language. Personally, I don't know how language wouldn't have been repeatedly reinvented by individuals again and again and again. And I'll tell you why I feel like this. As a twin, my twin and I grew up speaking just a weird language that only we could understand what we meant. And we couldn't half talk until we were almost 4 or 5 years old, but we sure as heck could understand each other. I just can't help but to think that even prehistoric human beings, hunter and gatherer folk, would have had to have had some form of communication that may not be the same as individuals, that might be spread far and wide from where they are. But nevertheless, it seems to me like it would make sense that people would continually reinvent language. Nevertheless, linguists do tend to trace languages back to proto-languages using a process. I should have bolded this word. If I were you, I would know it. They are backwards reconstruction. Okay? And so essentially what they would do is they would determine the relationship between languages based on comparing words that these languages would share, such as father, mother, brother, and other pronouns. Now, why would they use those? Well, everyone is going to have a word for these things, right? And so if you can look back and find relationships between words that for father and mother that sound like an older version of father and mother, and be able to relate that to other languages that may have stemmed from that proto or original language, then you're able to figure out the relationship between languages on the basis of these common words. Another way of doing it is not just words like father and mother and brother or pronouns, but you also might have words for things like the ocean, or words for things like different farm animals or different kinds of tools that they would have used for agriculture. Well, would someone that didn't live near the ocean have an original word for ocean? No. But someone that lived in like a steppe region might have a word for certain animals like horses. And so you can find where that word might have diffused and traced the migration pattern, more or less, of individuals that have carried that language with them. And the language has diverged, or that is, has changed over time with migration. Another way that linguists study these original languages and I guess the languages that shoot off of these original languages is through the study of the family tree. Just like you might have a family tree with your matriarch or patriarch as the oldest member of your family, languages are going to go back to, and this is kind of hard to see, it's very small, but this is probably in your textbook. If you use Rubenstein, this is in your textbook. You've got these proto-languages that would have been your individual language families. If you look here, for example, at the Indo-European language family, the Proto-Indo-European would have been like an original language that would have been spoken by individuals that eventually, due to migration and just space in between, the languages began to change over time, and it would become many of the languages that we speak today. And so language trees are used to show linguistic relationships. Here's a bigger version of that language tree. Notice that this number here is 2,722. Well, what this is trying to show you is the number of native speakers of these languages. And that would be ludicrous to think that the Indo-European language is so big with only 2,722 speakers. This is in billions. Oh, I'm sorry, this is in millions. So what we're looking at here is there are today 2.7 billion speakers of an Indo-European language of some sort. You look a little closer up here, I've got another graphic that shows this is just a fraction of some of the languages that might spin off of these language families. Okay, but really all of this is Indo-European. This isn't looking at any other language family, just the Indo-European language family. And you've got these different branches. Okay, so these are here would be the branches of the tree. These different branches represent other languages that further further broke apart, further diverged as time went on. So you've got the Balto-Slavic, you've got the Germanic, the Roman, the Celtic, the Indo-Iranian. These are all different languages that exist today that are part of the Proto-Indo-European language family. So why do we care so much about the Proto-Indo-European language? Where's a whole section of your book dedicated to just this one language family? I've already said it. There's almost half of the world's population today. If you're assuming that there was about 7.5 billion people on Earth, almost half of the world is speaking a Indo-European language. And not only are so many people speaking an Indo-European language, but it is diffused over such a vast chunk of the world's land with people living on it. So you got to think, I mean, I've got a map here that shows, I'll flip back in a second, but this map here, every single color represents an Indo-European language of some sort. And this is a huge swath of Eurasia, all right? Europe, Russia, Central Europe, the Middle East, Asia, all these people are speaking Indo-European language. And that doesn't include, we know that English and Spanish and Portuguese are all going to be Indo-European languages. So we already know that you've also got the Americas are speaking Indo-European languages. Parts of Africa speak it as a native language, and also many more parts of Africa speak it as a secondary language. Australia. So you can see that the reason why we spend so much time looking at the Indo-European is not because we think English is so great, even though we may think that, but it's really because we're thinking about so many people on Earth today speak an Indo-European language. So why? How did that come to be? All right, so yeah, we've already looked at this. Another thing too about this is that when you think about the globalized world in which we live, most of your MDCs today are speaking Indo-European languages like the Spanish, the most widely spoken as a native language, the most widely spoken Indo-European language is Spanish. English doesn't have as many native speakers as Spanish does, because you got to think about the Central and South America as well. Don't overcomplicate what you need to know about language families. You're studying geography, you're looking at the spatial context of world languages. So really, when you think about this, there's a lot of stuff on these maps. There's a lot of stuff on these language family charts that, it looks pretty intimidating. What is Occitan? I don't even know how you say that. I know what Catalan is. There's a bunch of different Romance languages, but really, I'm going to break it down and help you kind of know how to gear your studying for these things. And one of the best ways to do this, I guess I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. One of the best ways to do this is to focus really on, I would say focus on these ones right here more than anything else. And the reason for that is because these languages here, English, notice also that English is Germanic. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese is very, very widely spoken as well. These are some of your bigger languages. You also want to know Balto-Slavic because you want to think about Russia and basically most of your Eastern European countries. All right, and you also want to be able to think about Indo-Iranian, or I guess Indic. Sometimes you'll see it considered Indic with Hindi, but you also have things like Farsi, things like Urdu, these are languages in Afghanistan and in that region in Central Asia as well. There are two conflicting, I guess, similar yet conflicting origin stories, if you will, theories of how the Indo-European language may have dispersed into its current position on the Earth's, on the Earth's surface. And those two ways is, you'll see it cause several things, okay? I wrote all the different names of them up here. The Anatolian dispersion, or that is the Anatolian hypothesis. Rubinstein calls this the sedentary farmer theory. And then you've also got the Kurgan hypothesis, also known as in Rubinstein as the nomadic warrior. Now, I would know it by sedentary farmer and nomadic warrior, but almost everyone outside of Rubinstein calls these the Anatolian and the Kurgan hypotheses. So I would also be able to associate those regions with these theories. And here's how it works. According to the Anatolian dispersion, the Indo-European languages diffused with the invention and the expansion of agriculture. All right. So what we're assuming here is that last week we talked about diffusion. All right. We looked at expansion, diffusion versus relocation. Well, according to this guy, Colin Renfrew, okay, sometimes you'll see this called the Renfrew theory. The Indo-European language, the original speakers who spoke what we call Proto-Indo-European, would have started to take their language with them as they slowly, over thousands of years, expanded agriculture and their populations grew, and eventually the hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe started to either blend together with the farmers and speak an Indo-European language, or they were just beat out somehow by these farmers and moved on somewhere else, where eventually they lost their culture and their language. All right. The opposing theory, the Kurgan hypothesis, I didn't put the name of the lady. It was a lady. What was her name? I can't believe it. I can't think of it off the top of my head. It was another scientist about the same time as Colin Renfrew proposed this Kurgan hypothesis. And the way this works is around the base of the Caucasus Mountains, around the steppe region over here near the Black and the Caspian Seas, you've got these Kurgan warriors. And they did something really important. You see, this right here goes back to the invention of agriculture. These dates, probably a little bit, most scholars don't go as far back as 9,000, maybe around 8,500 BC, maybe not even quite that far. But the Kurgan hypothesis takes the beginnings of the Indo-European language back to about 4,500, maybe 5,000 BC. And the way that it spread is by horseback. Well, it just so happens that the horse became a domestic animal, or they tamed horses and learned how to ride horses around 4,500 BCE. So with the invention of that, people now can ride really far and really fast. These nomadic warriors would have learned how to drink animal milk, for example. So if they were riding horses, they may have drank some milk from these animals in order to sustain themselves for a long amount of time on horseback or for long amounts of travel. And according to the Kurgan hypothesis, these warriors ended up sweeping through Europe over the next several hundred, maybe 1,000 years, and eventually conquered all of the peaceful nomadic tribesmen or whoever it is that lived in Europe, speaking whatever language they used to speak, and replaced them with people that spoke an Indo-European language that they would have learned from the Kurgan warriors. So maybe that's a little bit brutal. Both of these different theories have some degree of controversy attached to them, or people will have conflicting reasons why they might believe one over the other. I will say that no matter how you feel about it, most individuals based on what I've read and what I've studied, most kind of believe that maybe the Kurgan hypothesis, whether it was all war and bloodshed, still they seem to think that the Indo-European language may have originated in that area and spread through the use of horses. Here's a map that shows the Kurgan hypothesis. Now, this area here that says Kurgan is actually your region where your Kurgan warriors would have lived, and this is the area where the horse was domesticated. So they domesticated horses and then began to kind of just go everywhere, and wherever they went, they brought their language with them, according to the hypothesis. The Anatolian hypothesis, this right here is Anatolia. On this map, this is Anatolia. Well, what modern-day Turkey is where Anatolia is? I just said what modern Turkey. I gave it away, didn't I? What modern country? It is the country of Turkey. So Turkey today is located on the Anatolian Peninsula. You can see that this right here is a peninsula. It has, it's surrounded by water on three sides. It makes it a geographic peninsula. And right about here, along the base of the Anatolian Peninsula, is where your agriculture would have emerged as far back as 9,500 years ago. That would have been approximately 7,500 to 8,000 BC. Okay, so you've got farmers would have migrated. It says right there, if I can get that dialogue to get out of the way, farmers migrated out of the Middle East, replacing or interbreeding with resident hunter-gatherers. And over a huge amount of time, it would have spread. This, again, is your Eurasian steppe. This map mentions the steppe hypothesis. And this right here shows that individuals used horse domestication to spread the language. So again, that's the basis of the two theories. Okay. I guess the main difference being the way that it was spread. These guys here spread on horseback. This right here will have spread for thousands of years simply by expansion, diffusion. Everywhere agriculture went, people settled down. They settled down and they began to speak Indo-European languages, the same languages that were spoken by those individuals that conquered them. Yet another image of the Renfrew or the sedentary farmer theory. Again, the Anatolian hearth. And then all these arrows show different areas where the Indo-European language would have gone to over the ensuing centuries. All right. Now, notice that you've got different arrows that represent different time frames. I don't know if I have it next or not. I don't. I'm going to get ahead of myself, and I'm going to teach you guys a word real quick. If you don't already know it, I would write this down and make sure that you know it. And that is the idea of language divergence. All right. So over time, when we talk about something that's going to diverge, the street might diverge. That means it's going to go this way. It's going to go this way. As people move and migrate and they separate from other groups, they settle down, and then maybe hundreds or thousands of years go on. They might learn new words. They might have new ways of saying things. The way that they said words might change over a huge amount of time. And the next thing you know, they might have, two languages might become completely unintelligible. If I'm speaking right now with someone who speaks French, I can't understand French. But yet, French and English are both Indo-European languages. The reason I'm saying this is because by the time this language is spreading over these thousands of years, it is already different. All right, these guys aren't speaking the same language that was spoken over here in 8500 BC. They're speaking something that's totally different as the centuries and the millennia go on because of language divergence. Better know these. This here is what I was talking about a little while ago when I showed you on the chart. When you're studying the Indo-European language family, you definitely want to make sure that you know something about these language families. And what do you need to know about these language families? Spatial perspective, all right? Be able to know which general set of countries speak an Indo-European language. Know which countries, predominantly which regions are going to speak Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian. Right? Make sure that you know that English is a Germanic language and not a Romance language. Make sure that you know that the Russians and Ukrainians and a lot of people that are in Eastern Europe region, they're Slavic. They speak Slavic languages. Indo-Iranian, when we talk about that, we're looking at Persian. By the way, when I say Persia or Persian, we're talking about Iranian. Today, Iran is what used to be called Persia. And also, Farsi, or Dari as it's known officially in Afghanistan, is the language of the Persians, but it's a dialect spoken in Afghanistan. All right, that's their official language. And then also this Indic language family, I guess Indic branch of the Indo-European language family, rather. The main thing you want to know here is Hindi, spoken by the majority of people who live in India. Not the only official language of India, by the way. When we look at other language families, you want to make sure that you know and associate Sino-Tibetan with Mandarin. Mandarin is now listen to me carefully here. Mandarin is the most spoken native language in the world. All right. There's more people natively speaking Mandarin than any other language by a lot. And that's because Mandarin is the main language spoken, I guess the official language, the one that the communist regime wants everyone to speak. It's the main language of China, right? So it's almost spoken by 1 billion people. English doesn't come close to that natively. I think Portuguese and Spanish are the next 2 on the list. They don't come close to that. All right, Arabic doesn't come close to that natively. So when you factor in as a second language, then English would be the most widely spoken because you've got about everyone in the United States plus a few more, maybe about somewhere close to 400,000 people are speaking English natively in the world. But then you might have over 1 billion people that are speaking it as a second language when you start trying to account for all that. Very, very hard to find an actual number for that, all right? So these are estimates, but just know that. Afro-Asiatic, you know that Arabic is the most important Afro-Asiatic language. It is diffused with the spread of Islam. I don't know if I've got a map for that. I do. This map right here, the red is your Afro-Asiatic. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone in this area is speaking just Arabic, but most of these people are speaking Arabic, and this is the most influential Afro-Asiatic language because it was diffused with the expansion of Islam. If you study Islamic expansion, you can see that the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties or caliphates would have correlated with this exact same territory. And today, most of the people that live here are Arabic, and they speak Arabic as their main language. So I would definitely make sure that you know that. This is the same stuff. Japanese, there's no related language families to Japanese. There's no related language families to Korean. Wait a second. Wait. You mean to say that the Chinese, the Japanese, and Koreans are all the same? No. They're not even close to the same. They're as ethnically different as we are from people in South America. All right. So here's Japan. They speak Japanese. Here's Korea, North and South. They both speak Korean. All right. I want to say that the written language here in Korea is called Hangul or something like that. I think it's something like that. It's unique. It is their own. Culturally, the Koreans, Japanese, and the Chinese, which is all this, they are not culturally the same at all. All right. So just make sure that you know that they are not speaking the same language. They are not the same. Basque. We were just talking about the expansion of the Indo-European language family. And you see that all of Europe is speaking, for the most part, more or less, a Indo-European language. But if you look right there where my cursor is, y'all see that? That is a small little mountainous area right at the northern tip of Spain and the southern tip of France. It literally goes across both borders. That right there is Basque country, okay? And they speak a unique language called Euskera. Let's see if Google got that. Nope, they didn't. Euskera, E-U-S-K-E-R-A is the name of the language that they speak in the Basque country. Now, the reason why this is so important and why you need to be writing it down in your notes and know this is because it is not an Indo-European language. It is literally the only European language today that predates Indo-European expansion. And really, you think about how in the world did this language survive when all other languages in Europe were replaced by an Indo-European language? It is unbelievable to think about it. And these guys have a very, historic national, an identity that is based in their language. They're not French. They're not Spanish. They have fought for autonomy. They are kind of semi or pseudo autonomous region within Spain. In some cases, you might even think of them as separatists, and in some other cases, the government has maybe even gone after them for trying to force themselves into an autonomous state. But nevertheless, a very, very unique culture because their language it predates Indo-European. So I would definitely know that about them, if nothing else. Okay, so Africa, how are we doing on time? Perfect. I think we were going to make it. Africa, the most linguistically diverse region on Earth today. In the world, you've got, like I said, about 6,700 languages. Those are estimates. About 2,000 of them alone are going to be in Africa. And linguistic diversity goes hand in hand with the ethnic diversity of the region. I don't know if y'all have seen, I should have included it. There's a map in most textbooks or online that show the ethnic distribution of the different groups. It shows the political boundaries of Africa, but it also shows the ethnic lines. And those ethnic lines, most of the time, they're speaking different languages where there's different ethnic groups. And most of these languages here, they're not big. They're not being spoken by thousands of people, or even hundreds in some cases. Some of these might have a few hundred, or maybe even less than that, native speakers. And so you got to also think that many of these languages aren't going to have written traditions. When you have all these different people groups speaking small, independent languages that are representative of their identity and their culture, it can add to political complexity. Here is a map of language families in Africa. I meant to show you guys that right here is Nigeria. You can't really see the boundaries very well. It is the most populous African state, also one of the most diverse linguistically. There are hundreds of different languages in just that one country spoken by different groups. And you imagine that if you've got political power being held by the speakers of one group, that group's languages might be preferred over the rest. I know that a lot of people in Nigeria also speak French, for example. But you also have maybe a power play where one group might have power over another group, and the language, I guess, the linguistic diversity doesn't help the complexity that you see in Africa. Another example of this is South Sudan. You can see this here is the country of Sudan, but in 2011, South Sudan becomes the newest country on Earth. So this here's the border between North and South Sudan, and this region down here is linguistically different from the region up north where they are speaking Arabic. So in the north of Sudan, they are Arabic and speak Arabic, and they're Muslim. In southern Sudan, I guess South Sudan, they are speaking Sudanic, or they're speaking a different language family. They are ethnically diverse. They are religiously diverse. They're not Muslims at all. They're not Arabic. They're native African. And so you can see that, again, the linguistic diversity goes hand in hand with the ethnic diversity in the region. When we look at English, right? When we look at English, it's not a Romance language, right? Now, when we talk about what a Romance language is, I mentioned that I showed a slide earlier with some of the Romance languages you need to know, and I'll go back to that real quick. I'm sorry. Right here. These are your Romance languages. And what I mean by that is they are derived from the language spoken by the Romans during the Roman Empire. What language do the Romans speak? Anybody know? Romans spoke Latin. They spoke Latin, right? And so everywhere throughout the Roman Empire, people were going to speak Latin. It was the official language. It was spoken by all the aristocrats, that is the nobility. It was spoken by the soldiers. Okay, it was the language spoken throughout the Roman Empire. But as time went on and the empire got really big, the bigger it got, the harder it was to kind of enforce policy or whatnot, and the language started to diverge and become different from different local regions. And so even though the troops might have spoken it, either the aristocracy might have spoken Latin, individuals started to speak a vulgar language or a vernacular language, and it didn't sound like official Latin. It began to diverge and become its own thing. All right. English was not a part of the Latin language, all right, but it was heavily influenced by French later on historically. So this right here, by the way, is a if you go on YouTube and you copy and paste this, you'll get an awesome 5-minute video that goes through a little bit of the early history and expansion of your English language. Okay, but and I just saw Sinclair where you put Italian. A good guess. Yeah, it would make sense since Rome was actually in Italy, and that's where the basis of the empire was before the West fell. But Latin actually predates Italian. Italian would have been your vernacular language there. Early on, if you look at the earliest history of English, you've got these Germanic tribes that came from your Scandinavia region, which is where Norway, Sweden, Denmark, all that. These individuals began to cross over the sea into the island of Great Britain. And when they got there, they began to kind of fight with the Celts, and eventually they established a dominance on the eastern side of the island, and the Celts kind of lived on the western side. And then over time, they still speak Latin there. Latin is not actually spoken it's considered a dead language. Now, we can still read, understand, and study Latin, but no one is speaking Latin as their primary language. So no, they speak Italian, but you will still see Latin spoken in different types of Catholic Mass, for example. Sometimes Latin is used in the medicine world. So you still see references to Latin. And people that study Latin today use it as a way of trying to study, all sorts of things. I just said like medicine, but they also want to look at connections maybe to other languages. So yeah, it still exists, but it's not being spoken anywhere as an actual language. It is considered a dead language, meaning that no one speaks it casually. But yeah, so these Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes is what they were, moved over into Great Britain, and it began to mingle with the Celts. And this right here is going to blend these two languages, Old English and Old Norse, kind of together as one. And this right here would be like the language that the people, I guess, your earliest versions of English that would have existed. It was known as Anglo-Saxon, right? And it sounded more like a German language than what English sounds like today. The reason why English kind of sounds like an Indo-European, I guess, not Indo-European, like a Romance language today is because in 1066, you've got William the Conqueror came in, and he is William of Normandy, actually conquered the island of Great Britain. He conquered England and established French as the official language in England. All right, so there for several hundred years, somewhere around the 1200s is when English became once again the official language of England. Well, people don't know that. What do we mean by official language? This is a word you need to know. It is simply the language of the government. Okay, it's going to be what all the official documents are written in. It's going to be what your street signs are written in. It's going to be what all legal papers and minutes and things like this are going to be. Maybe what Congress might be conducted in, or whatever it might be. This is going to be what an official language is. Notice that I wrote here that an official language is not the same as the language of the people. It doesn't have to be what the people speak in order for it to be an official language. All right. I say that to say the rich, the nobility, the power holders, the king and his nobility, they spoke French in England during this time. But common people, they didn't know French, and they didn't really have any reason to learn French. They continued to speak Old English. And eventually, through language convergence, more French-influenced English began to emerge. Now, we spoke earlier about language divergence being when a language kind of separates because of migration in space and becomes two different things. Convergence is the opposite, is when the two different linguistic groups come together and they begin to borrow words from each other. So eventually, over that course of time, English peasants started to learn that they could sound smarter, if you will, or sound more sophisticated like the nobility if they spoke French words. And so you start to see where there's a lot more French being brought into the English language. And usually the French words were the more complex sounding words. So if you look at some of your old English words, you might have I don't even know if I can think of any examples off the top of my head, but they were easy to say, usually like short one-syllable words, and then you've got things like different complex words like guy, like bourgeoisie, for example. Not a word they would have had back then, but you guys, if you ever study history, you know that bourgeoisie would have been a French word for the middle class. That's the kind of complexity I'm talking about here. Just words that just sounded more sophisticated, started to bring itself into our language, and it forever changed the way the English was going to be spoken. Another example is, as I just mentioned, Latin was spoken by Roman officials, okay? Latin was also spoken by officials of the church, I think is what I actually meant to put here. But due to language divergence, okay, exactly. Here's what I just told you a second ago. Language, I guess Latin had diverged over a huge amount of time. Latin started to change from region to region within the Roman Empire. After the fall of the Roman Empire, current Romance languages began to emerge. I'm not sure what that's the example of, though. Oh, okay, I'm talking. It was an example of an official language. That's what I meant. An example of an official language. I got a little bit mixed up there in my PowerPoint. Oh, you're very welcome, Sinclair. Today, English is only spoken natively, as I mentioned, by about 400 million people. There are about 320, roughly, million people living in the United States. So a lot, or most of the native-born English speakers are in our country. You've got a lot of them also in Australia and also in England. But when you think about the English language as a second language, it is approximately spoken by about 1.3 billion people. Because so many people learn English as a second language. Why is that? Well, it goes back to the British Empire. I should have shown a map of this. If you Google the British Empire, you'll see that the old adage, the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire. That was literally true. The sun at some point was shining on something that was controlled and owned by the British. Everywhere they went, they brought their culture, they brought their language with them. And so the British Empire is part of the reason why so many different groups speak English. It's also the reason why so many different countries have a parliamentary system, for example. You've also got World War II with the United States. After World War II was over with, we helped out with reparation. And so we had troops stationed in parts of Europe. We had troops stationed in Japan and parts of Asia. And wherever we went, we brought things like baseball, for example, in Japan. We also brought things like our language and our culture. And so the Japanese began very quickly to adopt elements of our culture and elements of our, maybe not language so much, but elements of our culture, and they diffused those into what would become J-pop. Or things like anime and different types of movies and ninjas and things like that. You've also got I just mentioned culture, the internet and entertainment. That's a big deal. The internet was first a United States thing. Obviously, as it diffused, the majority of it has been and still is in English. Now, that is over time changing. There is one of the biggest changes is that more Chinese, I think maybe Chinese is one of the fastest growing languages of the internet. But English is still number one in terms of most content on the internet is in English. Movies and stuff like that. Our movies released in countries all over the world. They're in English unless you get dubbing and subtitles, which most places are going to do. But a lot of people are introduced to English and introduced to American culture through entertainment as well. Economics and education, you've got multinational corporations like Nike and Apple. And there are some words that just don't, when people talk about Apple, they literally call it Apple in other parts of the world, right? Well, they might think about what an apple is and learn about an apple being a fruit and know the English word for that. And that's just a simple version of it. But there are so many different words that make itself into other people's languages simply due to the expansion of multinational corporations and the products that they are selling. They're maybe American products and are being sold in other places of the world like Africa, Asia, or the Middle East or whatnot. And also you've got journalists, news, airline pilots, and scholars. If you are and anywhere in Europe, you have access to European news in many different languages. In the United States, you've got groups like CNN, and they have international coverage. People have a lot of access to English through things like those things right there. For a little while, airline pilots learned English so that they can kind of use it as somewhat of a lingua franca as they traveled the world. Now, when we talk about lingua franca, this word should be bold. Sorry, it's not. A lingua franca is a language that is spoken as a common language between two groups. It is a full-out language. So I guess last week someone asked me if is English the world lingua franca? I think is the way that they said it. And I'm really hesitant to say English is the world lingua franca, but I understood what the student meant. English globally is the most spoken language as a lingua franca, meaning that a lot of people in the world will learn English. It's because maybe they speak French and they want to talk to someone who speaks Spanish, but they don't know Spanish and the other person doesn't know French, but both of them know English. English would be the lingua franca, or the word, the language that is used as a common language. Okay, I read a book called Map of Love in college, and it was actually pretty good. And it was basically a love story between a British lady who spoke English and an Egyptian fellow who spoke Egyptian and French. Well, the British lady knew French and the Egyptian guy knew French, so they fell in love and spoke French to one another as a second language when neither one of them had French as a primary language. Other lingua francas that are a big deal in certain regions of the world is Swahili in parts of Africa. Farsi or Dari is the language predominantly spoken as a lingua franca in Afghanistan, as I just mentioned. Farsi, by the way, is their word for Persian, so because they consider it to be the language of the Persians or the Iranians. French is a big lingua franca in different parts of their previous empire, which is mostly in Western Africa. Singapore, they speak English as a lingua franca there. It is replacing a local language called Singlish. About what percent of the world speaks English? It's hard to, well, if you're looking at English as a native language, 400,000 is a very, very small percentage. And I don't know exactly. You would take 400,000 as a percent of about 7.5 billion. So you could do some rough math and figure that out. But if you're looking at 1.3 billion speakers of English, when you factor in how many people may be speaking it as a second language, then it becomes roughly 1/6 of the world population might speak some version of English, either as a native or as a second language. So again, those numbers are estimates, but it's a huge amount. English is very, very important as a lingua franca. And also Arabic. I just mentioned a second ago that Arabic is really important in the Middle East. Well, it's not the only language spoken in the Middle East, but it is very much the language that most people are going to speak because most people know it. So Arabic is a big deal lingua franca in the MENA states, which that stands for Middle East North Africa. Know that usually in AP Human, I wanted you to know what MENA is, but usually in AP Human Geography, when people talk about the Middle East, they call it by its geographic term, which is Southwest Asia. All right, so make sure that you guys associate the Middle East with Southwest Asia. So you might hear it said that Arabic is spoken in Southwest Asia and North Africa. Other vocab words that we want to talk about. Pidgin language. This is simply the informal blending of two languages to make a language of interaction. Okay, don't get that mixed up with a lingua franca. All right, so a lingua franca is simply a language that is used as a language of commerce or a language of interaction between two groups that don't natively speak it. But when we talk about Pidgin language, if you might have back in early exploration, I guess back during the age of exploration, when you have the slave trade going on, many of your imported Africans that were sold into slavery to plantation owners in the Americas, they will have spoken their own language, okay? But eventually they began to blend those languages with English or French or Spanish or Portuguese or whatever it might have been that the Europeans were speaking. And they developed a Pidgin language. All right. Other examples of Pidgin language might be when Europeans first started to do trade in Asia. Many of the people in these Chinese spheres of influence, or even in Japanese regions, may have spoken some kind of a hodgepodge, informal blended mix between Chinese or Japanese and whatever European language the traders would have spoken. But over time, in the first example I gave you with the enslaved Africans, their language began to be passed down. Their Pidgin language began to be passed down to further generations and began to actually like get linguistic rules and grammar and things like that. It becomes a Creole language when that happens. All right. One of the best examples of Creole language is Haitian. Haitian Creole is a mix of African languages and French. And Haiti actually fought for and won independence from France during Napoleon's reign. It was part of the tragedy of the Americas for him. He had a hard time controlling his American possessions. And then you've also got Gullah in my state of South Carolina along the southern and eastern coast, and also into Georgia. You've got groups of these guys they are descendants of your African slaves that were brought into that region. And because of the islands and because of the general isolation, and also because of the fact that about 3/4 of those populations would have been slaves at the time, Gullah still persists today, but it is very much under attack, and many fear that it's going to be completely lost, which is actually pretty sad. I think that you can go on YouTube and see stories and stuff told in Gullah. I would encourage you to do it. It's a pretty cool thing. I'm running out of time here. Dialect is a regional variation of a language. All right. So dialects are not different languages. You can always understand a dialect, usually. All right. I say usually because the Chinese would say that Cantonese is a dialect of Chinese, but Mandarin and Cantonese are in fact completely different languages, but they use the same written system. So you can write in Mandarin and write in Cantonese and understand each other, but you can't speak the language and get it. It's weird how that works, but it just is. Dialect would be like the British dialect. They might have different words or different pronunciation, different accents, different sayings. My relatives in Minnesota, I never forget the first time I went up to Minnesota when I was in the 9th grade, and my cousin says, and I quote, "Why don't you go sit on the couch and pout?" And he said it just like that. And I was like, what? You say for me to go sit on the couch and pout? But he said, sit on the couch and pout. It was hilarious how it came out, but that's a dialect difference. We could still understand the guy, but man, he spoke odd compared to me and my southern accent. This here is also a YouTube link, okay? My Fair Lady, Why Can't the English? If you Google that, or I put that in YouTube, you can see where there was a song where the individuals sing about talking about dialect differences. I've always made my students watch that as well. And even though it's kind of cheesy, they've always gotten a kick out of it. Isogloss. I'm going to keep, by the way, I know it's 7:58 and I know that I usually get an hour. If you guys got to go ahead and go. I'm going to keep on talking, and I'm going to try not to make a habit of going too far over an hour, but I just want to make sure that I get you guys where you need to be for the test. An isogloss is a word that describes a language barrier or a geographic boundary between the two particular words being used. And the reason why I emphasize geographic barrier or boundary is because an isogloss isn't a word, guys. A lot of my students will say, well, Coke and pop are going to be are isoglosses. Nope, that is not correct. The boundary that exists, the geographic and spatial boundary that exists between where people say pop versus where people say Coke or soda, that is the isogloss. So where is the isogloss on this map? It is the boundaries that exist between the counties where one word is going to be used and another is going to be used. So in the South, overwhelmingly, what word are they using? They're using, give me a Coke. Give me a Coca-Cola. You know? I take one of them Coca-Colas. So you got the South. And up north, they call it pop. My relatives in Minnesota, the guy he says, hey, You want a pop? I'm like, what? What's that? Well, you know, pop. I'm like, Coke? I'll take a Mountain Dew. How about that? We tend to call it by whatever it is, or just say Coke for like, you know, generic. It's only recently where you go up at McDonald's and say something like, hey, I'll take a Pepsi. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have Pepsi products, we have just Coke. I mean, everybody knows what you mean when you say that, right? That's an isogloss. You've got other examples like y'all and you guys. Y'all, you all, y'all. Okay. My people in Minnesota, man, they say you guys. You guys. I'm like, y'all, man, it's easier to say. So that this right here, by the way, this link, if you Google y'all, I'm sorry, how y'all use guys talk, man, do this. It is so cool because what it does is it will test your dialect. It will pinpoint where you live based on the words that you say. Give it a shot. For me, it is spot on accurate. It knows me very well, even down to the city. Y'all, I live really close to Augusta, Georgia. I'm actually in South Carolina, but man, it put me in Augusta, y'all. So I'm telling you, give it a shot. It only takes you maybe about 5 or 10 minutes to figure out where you're from based on the words you use. And that there wraps me up. All I've got left is a few questions, and you guys can do it if you want, or if you don't want. And I've got them listed in the poll. So if you look in the poll, this is question 1. If y'all want to do it, or if y'all just would prefer me just to talk about them or do them together somehow, you can do it however you want. I'll give y'all a few minutes to think about the answer, and I encourage you to go in the poll and tell me what the answer is, and we'll talk about it. So the question is all of the following are Latin-based Romance languages except. All right, I haven't seen anyone answer the question yet. Let me check one more time just to make sure. I'm going to go ahead and give it to you. We talked about the Romance languages, and we said the only one that is not a Romance language is English. Right? Is English. English is in fact a Germanic language. It is heavily influenced by French, but it is in fact from the same branch and same family as German. Next question. Which statement about the English language is correct? This is somewhat of a trick question. I'm going to tell you straight up. It's a good one. The answer to this question, let me see if anyone has answered it. The answer to this question is it has largely been influenced by the French language. What in the world? What do you mean, Fowler? How in the world is it not the official language of the United States? Simply, ladies and gentlemen, write this down. There is no official language in the United States. But English! No, but the Star Spangled Banner, but the Pledge of Allegiance, these things have to be said in English. Ladies and gentlemen, I say it again, there is no official language in the United States, okay? English is the most spoken. At the state level, you may have some states that might have a English, and they maybe have English as somewhat elevated status or whatnot, but no. as an official language, the United States doesn't have one. All right. So just know that. Just know that. I know y'all are gonna go home and Google that just because. An isogloss. An isogloss is what? It's going to be a boundary between language regions. Notice that the E choice says a collection. I can make that go away. Says a collection of unique words. No, it's not the words. It's the boundary between them. It's the boundary between them. I've only got a few more. What is this? I think I've got this one and then two more. We'll go through them quick. Dialects. Oh, actually, on that note, I believe that I need to go ahead and go because hey, Miss Amanda is going to be doing a live note-taking session, and I need to be finished up so that she can get on. Do this. I love doing this. Tell your friends about me and tell your friends what's going on here and how helpful it is so that they'll join on as well. We'll look at these questions next time if you guys want to. And with that said, thanks for watching. Peace out. I'll catch you guys on the internet next time around.